All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about a period called the Gilded Age, which took place from basically the beginning of Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War up until the beginning of the 20th century. So we're talking about a 45-year period. And the Gilded Age was concerned with basically two main questions. Um, how did the United States become an industrial power at the end of the Civil War? And secondly, how did the Gilded Age change ideas of politics, labor, and the economy? So the Gilded Age takes place within something called the Second Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution happened at the end of the 18th century, and so now we're into the second. And this was characterized by a booming economy. The country had a lot of natural resources, an abundant labor supply now that African Americans were freed, and also immigrants were moving into the country in record numbers, and the economy was expanding very rapidly, and business was quickly becoming the country's main concern. But all of this was built on something of a shaky foundation. There were massive amounts of corruption. Um, and though the country was producing a lot of wealth, it was only going into the pockets of a very small portion of the population. So in 1873, Mark Twain, along with a novelist named Charles Dudley Warner, wrote a novel entitled The Gilded Age. And the title implied that there was a brilliant and golden surface that masked a core that was rotten and gross. Twain and Warner were referring specifically to corporate dominance of politics and oppressive treatment of workers, farmers, and basically anyone who was left behind. And they weren't wrong. There were very powerful corporations who seemed to be immune to laws and regulation. Railroads were the number one offenders, railroad companies. They were known for enjoying a huge amount of influence in the government at both the state and the federal level. The government was very stable, well, relatively stable at this time, but they were still too small to deal with these large corporations. These corporations were creating monopolies, creating environments in which they could oppress their workers and make them work insanely long hours for very low pay. Many, however, thought that this was inevitable because of the idea of social Darwinism. So this was a very popular idea. Social Darwinism built off Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, but applied it to social standards. Social Darwinism sought to explain why some people were rich and some were not. Basically, the rich were rich because of their superior knowledge, skill, work ethic, and overall capabilities, whereas the poor were slow, dim-witted, lazy, shiftless, dirty, and they were just naturally that way. And so this meant that the strong and smart and wise would inevitably rise to the top while everyone else, the lazy, the shiftless, the dirty, would fall and remain at the bottom. And this was a natural process. And because it was natural, government shouldn't interfere with it. So this same concept applied to giant corporations, right? So some corporations thrived because they were just naturally better than others. So up until this time, businesses had been run mostly by individual families. They did their own manufacturing, their own marketing, and their own selling, and sometimes they did it all within the walls of their own home. But leading into the Gilded Age, you started to see businesses expanding to control their own supply chains. So they essentially controlled every aspect of the production process. Small businesses that didn't have the resources were mostly seen as too weak to handle the progress. And so they deserved to die in order to free up resources for the larger corporations, which were better managed, produced better products, and were just overall better. So this represented a massive shift in the American economy. The country began to move away from the Jeffersonian ideal, which was the idea of the educated farmer who owned his own land and and could run the country. Um, Now, though, with the Gilded Age, the country begins to embrace industrial capitalism. People were now more concerned with finding jobs and working for a wage than they were with owning land. You see new types of professions start to pop up, like craftsmen who specialize in just one aspect of production instead of manufacturing an entire product. You also see the birth of managers. This came out of a desire to increase efficiency. The railroad companies, again, were at the forefront of this movement. They were concerned with efficiency in almost all aspects of production. Trains and rails had to be manufactured quickly, and trains had to run on time. And so they were the ones who came up with the different time zones, and that was in order to get their trains to where they needed to go on time and to eliminate time confusion. Um, and this also represented a shift in the meaning of free labor, which up until now had meant that the small producer or family could enjoy financial success because they lived in a free and equal society. Now, however, the idea of free labor meant unrestrained operation of capitalism. The country was no longer an agrarian economy, but an industrial one. So now, the main question that the country had and had to deal with was, how do we deal with labor? Strikes began to increase. You start to see more and more strikes and demand for better working conditions. Courts, both on the federal level, state level, district level, usually sided with corporations, and workers were forced to find their own support any way they could. And this is when you start to see an increase in unions and union membership. And eventually, many reformers, many people became reformers because they began to notice a need for change. Reformers like Twain and Warner noticed that something was very wrong. Most of these reformers came from the middle class, actually, and were fueled by Protestant ideals of equality. Many argued for something called a social gospel, which condoned the idea that the spiritual well-being of a country depended on the equalization of wealth and power. You shouldn't have power and wealth all within one single group. It should be distributed across the board. So you started to see groups like the Knights of Labor, which was the largest labor group of the 19th century. And religious leaders began to fight for workers to be treated better. Violence also became much more common around businesses. Strikes became more frequent. Businesses would then try to break the strikes and bring the strikers down, either with a city police force or with their own strike breakers, just hoodlums that they hired off the street to come beat people up. One example of this, probably the best example, is the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, in which iron workers organized a strike against a factory called the McCormick plant. The company had tried to put down the strikers with their own hired force, and eventually chaos erupted, and in May of 1886, 4 strikers were killed. The next day, someone threw a bomb into a crowd of protesters, which led to the arrest of 8 union leaders. Even though the evidence against them was really weak, 4 of these 8 were executed. 1 committed suicide, and the rest remained in prison for several years. So, in summary, the Gilded Age represents a dramatic shift in the ideals and practices of the United States. The economy shifted from agrarian-based to industrial-based, and which led to a difference in how Americans viewed their economic interests. Social Darwinism became the primary argument against those who believed that ordinary Americans um, who used collective efforts against social Darwinism was the argument against common Americans who banded together to improve their own situation. And so I can't really uh, um, say or talk about the importance of the Gilded Age. It was very important. Everything changed during this time. As the economy changed, people's ideals of society and freedom, role of the government, everything changed because of the way the economy was going. And that's it. Thank you.